So I'm going to talk about cloud is not just for Christmas, because I can tell you, as someone who we run cloud services computing, we see this huge, we're in peak season. I can tell you peak season. Peak season is December the 8th between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. in the UK. Why? Because if you're buying something online and you want to get it to your loved ones, that apparently is the day. Maybe the 9th, I can't remember now. But we've got customers who are literally going to double or triple their capacity in that very, very short window. And that's why, as everyone will know, it's a great thing, right? It's a great thing to have, that burst capability to deal with those seasonal changes. The origins of this really was someone with a Christmas rush, right? So we know that value. But is it more than that? And this really gets to this point. So very quickly, for those who don't know who Interoute are, I'm going to do this at speed. So if you have more questions, there are guys outside. Interoute is Europe's largest digital platform. By that, we mean we do everything from the infrastructure, from the ground to the cloud. We have every customer across a wide spectrum of areas in terms of from every incumbent provider in Europe, all the major over-the-top plays out of the US, your favorite social media companies, etc., right up to the likes of more discerning enterprise customers like UEFA, Rank, and others. So Interoute does it really at a platform level, and our whole point about this is really it's networking and computing. That's what people buy to build digital infrastructure, and you can either buy it at 1 hour from us, and that's your minimum charge, and you can do that, or you can sign up for 10 or even 25 years at the bottom, right? So it depends on where you want to sit. Most enterprises start in the middle and work their way up. Most big providers start in the middle and work their way down. It's a fairly well-worn job. What we've been doing for the last 10 years is make it easier. That's the job of the CTO. Try and go from what was, frankly, dead hard in 2003 to something much simpler in 2012. So it means that we do facilities, platforms, and as a service. That's Interoute in a nutshell. 1 hour to 25 years. Think about that. That's what we do. So at some level, and I am hoping, and I'm almost note to self, will I stop talking about this subject in this way next year? I don't know, right? But this point is I've spent this year, you see a lot of customers talking to them. And a lot of it is, oh yeah, I'm not ready for the cloud. Why is that then? Security, the issue that came up, this, that, and the other. Why? Because it's framed by a very strong perception of what that means, right? The cloud, and I think you'll hear this throughout the day, is not a technology. It is actually a delivery or consumption model, right? It's a way of matching your needs in a far more optimal way. I used to run a software company many years ago in the States, and we used to have to produce product and put it into distribution, and we were spending money before we'd even sold anything. These days, you wouldn't do that. You'd have your software, you'd stick it up there, and if you sold it, you'd have some consumption. So it's a beautiful model. You're just optimizing your efficiency to the market. You're optimizing your efficiency in terms of consumption. So the question then becomes, what can you do with it? So the received wisdom is that you have issues with geography. It may not be in the right place for you, either at a performance or regulatory level. The connectivity, universally, most people talk about the internet, or obviously Interoute does do network at fairly levels. Fairly scant direct services, frankly. Service and support, again, is the SLA the one that makes sense for you or for the person giving it to you? Control, security, privacy, flexibility, and cost. There is almost, to use that horrible Gartner expression, a trough of despair in some regards in terms of people saying, well, let's give it a good kicking now. I've done the hype. And that's a kind of journalistic sort of mood shift. But the truth being, there are perceived constraints within this way of thinking about it. Fundamentally, it's wrong, right? It's wrong because it's making a critical error in terms of the way things progress. Everything, if you look at our experience for the last 10 years, the digital services we provide rely on 4 things: people, real estate, power, and silicon. We have always just driven down this silicon cost curve. We know that in everything that we do. So fundamentally, the idea that our present reality is our future, and that's how we should form our way of adopting it, is fundamentally incorrect. So Even if you don't buy into it, most people will argue that to use the cloud in a sensible way, you need to have a loosely coupled application, limited sustaining of session data, and don't rely on latency, because it may not be consistent. So let's start again. What are you trying to achieve? Effectively, if we buy into, and I don't think anyone's arguing, that as a consumption model, as a business model, as a way of thinking about your services in terms of, I don't want to have an 18-month planning cycle, right? I want to be able to really have very fine control of how I'm thinking about things. I want to, if you can remove 18 months of planning, you're removing 18 months of getting it wrong, right? So it's not rocket science. This is all about reducing errors in decision-making, perceptions of markets, etc. So the key thing here is, how much of this can I use for my current problem? And that's the one way to think about it. If you look at most enterprises, fundamentally one of the key things, skip whether you think it's a good way of buying or servicing assets, most enterprises are ill-equipped and ill-set up to deal with the way people want to consume services, right? There is a very, very vociferous mobile edge in terms of how people want to work. And one of the challenges it presents to traditional infrastructure is frankly on the wrong side of the distribution point. The distribution point and all of this technology is born out of that wonderful thing we call the internet, right? Which has a beautifully simple way of defining its way of distributing content, distributing access, and being ubiquitous. The modern, or if you like, traditional IT structures tend to set themselves off that platform, isolating themselves. And therefore, you are always going to have trouble trying to serve something which is a moving feast. The 9 a.m. peak as everyone logged on, 5 a.m. drop as everyone went home, those sort of days don't really sort of exist anymore. So you've got this sort of, not only have you got a challenge of aging legacy infrastructure, you've also got a irritable, almost adolescent-like user base who want to be able to do stuff when they want to do stuff. So the challenge is, I'm going to use the cloud, but how do I do it? So if you look at cloud computing, and let's call it version 1, not a fan of the kind of version 1, version 2, but forgive me this time. It is still fundamentally a somewhere in the cloud model. It's a very US-centric way of thinking about it, because in the US, you can have an offering which is a sort of an inch wide and a mile deep. It works brilliantly, right? Having lived and worked there, personally, it's a beautiful place to do business, compared to Europe, where you'd love to embrace it as such, and then you realize that the kind of Germans, the Swiss, the French, the Italians, and they kind of all want to do something different, right? Especially when it comes to regulation, data sovereignty, etc. So you have this fundamental model which says, I'm going to have my compute, and then the network bit, I'm just going to use that internet thing, right? Because it solves a whole slew of problems. And then even if I do go out to the cloud, because it's easy, all I'm doing is building, yet again, disparate silos. And I'm using some form of maybe application-centric or encryption-centric way of binding these things together. This assumes that the integration of the last 40 years is stopping, grinding to a halt. Moore's law is slowing down, we know that. Is it going to grind to a halt? Not really. So are we stuck in 1999? 1999, you had almost a not well documented, but a schism in the way people thought about services. We had a thing called the internet. It was a beautiful thing. I was a software developer back then. You skipped these network things because they were just too hard. And frankly, dealing with most of the people involved was too hard. So, but what happened quietly over that time, technologies like MPLS came along, which essentially give you that internet any-to-any capability, but deal with that security problem, right? In a very simple, scalable way. Skip a lot of the other things people talk about with this particular technology. It is a secure way of defining a domain, and that's about it. And then, obviously, the last place to put your computing is outside of that. Because if you look at the last 10 years, the edge of the cloud, to use that expression, in terms of capacities, in terms of price, is fairly static. Why? Because most of the cost of connecting yourself up are based on labor rates, and people like to be paid more. The core, conversely, is a pure silicon argument. Therefore, in terms of scale, the cost difference It is so much cheaper, right? Hundreds and hundreds of times cheaper to put things in a network than it is to have them at the edge of the network. This is not rocket science. You know, the big online distributors put their warehouses in the UK. Where? Northampton. Why? Because the M1 and the M6 are there, right? That's your point of distribution. So it makes sense to move it all into this cloud, for want of a better word. So what we did is we had a whole community of customers, enterprise customers, and we had a whole community of, if you like, traditional managed hosting customers. But the problem is they want that cloud dynamic, but they say, I'm not going to skip out to the internet because this is my Active Directory service, right? I want it within that secure domain. How do you do that? We did a thing, we virtualized the network. These days, you'd obviously call that a software-defined network or any of the other acronyms that people are kicking around. But essentially what it means is that you can attach any compute asset and then you define whether it's private or it's public by its association with a network, because fundamentally that's what defines public and private. You can then reserve off that asset to make it even more private if you so choose. But fundamentally the point being is the cloud is great in terms of a consumption model, but you want to bind it together. You want to preserve the way in which you use things. We then, because we're able to, push this thing all over the world, obviously starting in Europe. And why did we go to all these places in Europe? Is it because of latency? Somewhat. Madrid is a long way away from anywhere, frankly, at a sort of light speed level. But in terms of Geneva, Berlin, we have just opening Frankfurt, 3 locations in London. It's to do with regulations. It's to do with people who say, I'm a German banking app, I need it in Germany. In fact, I need 2 sites in Germany. I'm a Swiss charity, I need it in Geneva. In fact, I need 2 sites in Switzerland. Can you do Zurich? The model for us is just proliferating out the network. Bear in mind we can do this because we've already been gifted, if you like, the infrastructure in which to place the silicon. And what this means, it's not an original idea. Robert Metcalfe, 1972, mentioned that networking is inter-process communication. And what we're talking about here is a coming together. So you have a better level of control over the method by which you're binding together your processing assets and the computing assets themselves to the likes of John day to day. So you end up with this concept. We call it unified ICT. It's very simple. You get a network ID, right? First thing you do, whether you know it or not, that's what you do. You're a member of something. Into that, we put general purpose cloud computing, virtual data center, we call it. Gives you a lump of CPU, disk, and RAM. You can spread it anywhere, right? You sign up, you get 13 sites globally, and you could have 1 server in LA, you could have 1 server in Hong Kong, and 1 server in Berlin, and we'll charge you for 3 servers. We will not charge you for the bit in the middle. The network is free. Why? Largely because we can. You then have other specialist forms of computing. This is our OneBridge platform, which is really GPU clusters for any device video conferencing or high-performance computing. But the best thing about it, from a hybrid perspective, is it binds together any asset. You know, we've got a lot of customers in the hybrid world who, that's an AS400. You can't virtualize an AS400, right? Not yet, at least, is my way. Or an old IBM Linux, a Unix box. So what it does is it gives you a contiguous view of your environment, chuck in the fact that we obviously, at a networking level, can give you direct access in over 127 countries. And now you've got a platform for migration. It deals with this issue largely through creating the relationship at the network level. And then we layer on top automation. As you'd expect, it's a cloud product. It needs to be instantaneous. And then we layer connectivity, communications, and computing. So what we've done, if you look at it, you start at a web-centric or Microsoft-centric or simple machine level, and then you get into your infrastructure. And then you have a community of folks who are automating it. So finally, and I'm 49 seconds, nearly getting there, answering the question. If you have a platform like this, it means, and we just did some analysis, you're basically closer to the problem that you're solving. And latency is a great thing when you're dealing with the predominant technology which you use to move your stuff around, which is TCP. TCP is very latency dependent, so the closer you are, the throughput is higher. the download speeds are higher, and it means a lot of legacy apps will work a lot easier because they are mostly written with a switch infrastructure in mind, and they don't appreciate suddenly finding out that that switch is a bit in Amsterdam and a bit maybe in, I don't know, Berlin or worse, New York, right? So if you bind them together, you can start to have a much more cohesive argument, and the universe of solutions that you can use gets larger. So effectively, you get the same kind of idea, but you don't have the compromise. So in terms of geography, symmetrical single-digit latency for most of Europe. Connectivity, you can either put it on the private or the public side. Services and support, we're a big enterprise provider. Control, we actually give you control down to the switch level in terms of how you create real RFC 1918 type addressing. And then security and privacy, we've just grandfathered a technique that's been worked most enterprises for the last 10 years. And then the flexibility of cost, back to the beautiful thing about most cloud consumption models. Just a very quick one on customers. Open University in Italy, a dental replacement firm in Belgium who just shut down their data centers, the European Space Agency, and the guys in the developer world. The idea being it's a very capable way of thinking about just an infrastructure platform. So the cloud, I think most people agree, it's not a choice, it's an inevitability. We believe the compromise, people, that, oh, should I do private, should I do public? That's kind of going to disappear. We saw it disappear with networking. We saw it disappear with communications. It'll disappear because you'll basically integrate the whole thing together. That's how it's been done in the past. That's always how it's somewhat always been done. And you don't have the issue of, oh, do I buy into that particular club of, someone's different version of managing hypervisors? You skip all that argument because you've dropped it down to a level which you know will work, which is fundamentally building relationships at a kind of VLAN to VRF level. The question, obviously, is timing and planning. We think we've eliminated that, so your migration, consolidation, and transformation can sort of move forward at speed. And the key thing to bear in mind is it is, you'll hear this all day, it is a journey. You're going to start somewhere, and it will take time. But the great thing about this, unlike pretty much a lot of the other technologies that have come before it, you can actually try it, right? So you can have listened, and unfortunately I'm slightly up, you can have listened to me and you can listen to all the other speakers, and you can think, well, okay, that's a nice little pitch, but that's what they do for a living. The proof of the pudding is very much in the eating. So then you go off, try it, and then you form your own judgment. And that really is the most powerful thing about this. Try it and see if it works for you. And then your experience is informed, and your decisions and planning going forward are then based on real experience rather than trying to hedge whether this guy or that guy has got the right idea. Thank you very much.